Because of the tyranny and greed of the corporate crown, the colonizers seceded from the English Empire with the Revolutionary War in 1775. With the Declaration of Independence, America became a sovereign nation and a place people could go where everybody's authority is both recognized and respected as king. The Republic was governed by the private sovereign peoples of America, who could act as their own legislatures under natural law, which is our nation's highest form of law. To ensure that corporatocracy could never again enslave the peoples of America, our founding fathers separated government into two factions. The democracy was governed by politicians who worked with corporations, overseeing international trade and war. This separation prevents corporations from using government to take all of the land and resources, thus forcing people into slavery like it had in England. After the war, the public government needed money to build their new nation. They went back to the Bank of England because it was the only bank willing to work with them, and they were loaned fiat currency. Because the public government was essentially bankrupt at its conception, America's foreign creditors drafted a debt-collecting document in 1789, known as the Constitution of the United States. With the prompting of President George Washington and in accordance with public international law, America built a private central bank in 1791, named the First National Bank of the United States. The foreign-owned private bank was to collect the debt from the public government for 20 years. In 1811, the 20-year contract was up and the debt was due, but Congress didn't want to pay anymore. In accordance with public international law, England attacked Washington, D.C., the public government, burning down the White House and Library of Congress during the War of 1812. The Second National Bank of the U.S. was then established in 1816 for an additional 20 years. Vehemently against central banks, President Andrew Jackson vetoed the renewal of the Third National Bank in 1832 on the premise that Congress doesn't have a right to establish a national bank, nor does the U.S. to establish corporations. Moreover, the Bank of England only loaned fiat currency, which is essentially nothing but worthless paper. Because nothing of intrinsic value was loaned to America, the creditors never had a perfected lien. Therefore, public international law doesn't actually apply, and the public government owes nothing. However, that didn't stop Congress from impeaching President Jackson in 1837, and two failed assassination attempts were made on his life soon after. America progressed without a central bank for the next 22 years, but in 1859, the foreign creditors came back again. Congress lost its sovereignty that year. However, the individual people and states still retained theirs. The foreign creditors could not legally touch them. Instead, the British started sending agents into southern states. The cotton growers of the South had close business relationships with English manufacturers. Conspiring with local politicians, the English agents started sowing seeds of propaganda, which resulted in the South's secession in 1860, leaving the North to pay the debt, dissolving the Union. The Civil War began in 1861, with the Rothschilds funding both sides, plus interest. During the chaos and confusion, the foreign creditors then started dipping into the United States Treasury. President Abraham Lincoln declared Executive Proclamation 1, reconvening Congress under military authority. He then enacted martial law, extending the laws of the Public District of Columbia to encompass the several states as well. Under martial law, public property is to be protected by holding their legal titles in abeyance, which is like a trust. This action stopped the foreign creditors from pirating the U.S. Treasury. In 1863, President Lincoln grew tired of paying the Rothschilds rates of interest, stating that their fractional reserve money system created economic slavery. The president began issuing interest-free money called greenbacks. 2 years later, Lincoln was assassinated by the actor John Wilkes Booth, who was later reported to have close connections with Europe and had made at least one trip to England prior to the assassination. Congress formed a commercial agency within Washington, D.C. 6 years after Lincoln's assassination through the District of Columbia Organic Act of 1871. Now Washington, D.C. is an official private corporation doing business as the United States. The democracy was officially born after Congress was established as a federal corporation. It was then incorporated into England under the same name. The Constitution was copywritten by the Crown, and the United States became entirely governed by corporate law, dictated by banks. An example of this in media can be found in Season 5, Episode 1 of Parks and Recreation. Leslie Knope and her co-worker Andy were taking a tour of Washington, D.C., when Knope exclaimed that our nation was born in 1776. Andy questioned which nation. Andy was inviting the viewer to the realization that there have been two Americas established, the real one in 1776 and the foreign-controlled corporate one in 1871. Foreign bankers and monarchy have cloaked themselves under the skin of our nation's law like a Trojan horse. America has been completely ruled by foreign corporations through martial law since 1871. It proceeded to create another central bank in order to collect the alleged debts they claimed were owed to them. Both the Federal Reserve Act and the Aldrich Plan were drafted on J.P. Morgan's private resort by Baron Alfred Rothschild in 1909. Also in attendance were 7 other men who together comprised 1/4 of global wealth. In 1935, Vanderlip stated to the Saturday Evening Post that we were told to leave our last names behind us. We were instructed to come one at a time and as unobtrusively as possible. If it were exposed publicly that we had written a banking bill, it would have no chance whatsoever of passage. It had to be created by legislation and sustained by the power of government under the deception of protecting the consumer. The National Monetary Commission was ordered to prepare the bill in public, and President Wilson passed the Federal Reserve Act in 1913, creating America's third central bank. The Federal Reserve Bank is not a governmental agency, and neither were the first or second national banks. They are all privately owned corporations which send money directly to foreign creditors. What was the deceptive protection Vanderlip was talking about? During the 1907 bankers' panic, the government's debt was due again, and the Bank of England took the sovereign people's gold, even though they never contracted with them and were not liable to pay anything. Then, in 1929, the public government's debt was due again, and the creditors stole billions in gold from the private people and moved it to various European banks. This made America's paper receipts worthless, which caused the subsequent market crash. With the financial emergency, Roosevelt reissued martial law, allowing the public government to continue claiming authority over the various states. The New Deal in 1933 prompted private people to become citizens of the Military United States Corporation through the registration of their birth certificates. In exchange, the people were given privileges, such as Federal Reserve notes, benefits and services, and the right to give their opinion through voting. As public employees, Americans' property and income are now considered public property as well, being held in trust and is now taxable. In 1933, Americans became indentured servants to the Crown of England and international banking conglomerates once again. In 1965, President John F. Kennedy tried to reinstate notes-based intangible assets. Shortly thereafter, he was assassinated and the banks took American silver. It is rumored that the Bush family was involved with Kennedy's assassination. The Bush family are also blood-related to the English monarchy. The actions perpetrated by the government would be considered treason, if not for them allowing us to extricate ourselves from their corporate ship. Utilizing public international law, one can emerge as a secure creditor, claiming priority interest in their property, thus allowing one to have quiet use and enjoyment, safe harbor, and safe passage. At this stage, we're considered our own bank and can create our own negotiable instruments, such as a promissory note, to allow foreign creditors to balance their books. However, for those still trapped in this economic and legislative maze, their role as public employees to a bankrupt corporate state have left them and their posterity to lifetimes of voluntary servitude and feudalism. In 2012, President Barack Obama passed the National Defense Authorization Act, declaring war against the citizens of America. The public, military, corporate, foreign-controlled government now reserves the right to arrest and detain indefinitely without charge, trial, or recourse. In 1774, the London Times published an article saying that North America will be without debt. It'll become prosperous without precedent in the history of the world. The brains and wealth of all countries will go there. That country must be destroyed, or it will destroy every monarchy on the globe. America's first two wars were to get away from the banks, corporations, and centralized power in the form of monarchy. Every war since then has been orchestrated, funded, and promoted by these very same groups.